Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum today. It's spooky season all year round on this show, but we're doing more than just reading a scary story today. We'll uncover some fascinating stuff about Poe's life and writing, too.
Yeah, you can't fully appreciate a story like this without getting to know the author. Like, what in his life led him to create this dark, horrifying world?
I mean, his life was pretty tragic. Abandoned by his father, his mom died when he was young, and then he was taken in by the Allens. But it sounds like that wasn't exactly the best situation either.
No, not at all. Loss and instability were kind of constants in Poe's life, and it definitely shows up in his writing, wouldn't you say? Like that feeling of being trapped, both physically and mentally.
Totally. It makes you think that The Pit and the Pendulum might be a reflection of his own experiences, right?
Absolutely. He had this really strained relationship with John Allen, especially when it came to finances. Poe was constantly struggling, trying to find his place in the world.
I read that he even joined the military under a fake name.
Yeah, he did. He bounced around a lot, trying different paths, the military, university, even West Point. It's like he was always searching for something. But that need for reinvention also comes through in his writing.
It's fascinating how all these pieces of his life come together in his work.
Oh, yeah. His writing really seems to be a product of his experiences, his struggles, his obsessions.
And speaking of obsessions, he was obsessed with becoming a successful writer. I mean, he wanted to make a living solely through writing. That was a pretty bold move back then.
Oh, it was a huge risk, especially in America at that time. There were no international copyright laws, so he was competing with cheaper, unauthorized reprints of British authors. Tough market to break into, especially when you're trying to make it your main gig.
It makes you appreciate his talent even more. He was publishing poetry, short stories, even literary criticism. He really left his mark on American literature.
He was a pioneer, for sure, and he was really interested in pushing the boundaries of literature. He actually rejected didacticism, the idea that stories have to teach a clear moral lesson. He was more interested in creating a certain atmosphere, a specific emotional impact.
So he didn't want to just tell you what to think. He wanted to make you feel it.
Yeah, like plunge you right into the darkness, the suspense, the psychological terror.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes The Pit and the Pendulum so effective. It's not just a scary story, it's a psychological thriller.
Yeah.
It takes you deep into the mind of the narrator, makes you experience his fear and despair.
And it all comes back to Poe's fascination with the darker side of human nature, right? Death, decay, the power of guilt. And the Spanish Inquisition provides the perfect backdrop for all of that.
Yeah, it's interesting that he chose that setting, considering he wasn't a particularly religious person.
But he was drawn to the psychological torment, the fear of the unknown, the abyss of, existential dread. And that's what we're going to explore in The Pit and the Pendulum.
I can't wait to dive into the story itself. But before we get there, have you ever felt like you're drowning in a sea of information? Like you're constantly scrolling and clicking, but you never really find anything truly engaging?
Like you're just stuck.
Exactly. Like you're in your own metaphorical pit of information overload. But fear not. The All Sorts podcast is here to rescue you. We'll be your beacon of light in the darkness of the internet.
We'll illuminate those hidden gems, those fascinating topics that you might have missed in the endless scroll.
And we'll do it all in an entertaining and insightful way, just like we're doing with Edgar Allan Poe today. So if you want to escape the pit of information overload, hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel, The All Sorts podcast, and make sure you click that notification bell so you don't miss a single episode.
And don't forget to connect with us on X, Instagram, and Threads. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this deep dive into The Pit and the Pendulum and really on anything we talk about.
Right. We want to build a community, a place where we can all explore the wonders and maybe the terrors of the world together.
Yeah.
So enough with the chit-chat. Let's get back to Poe, shall we?
Definitely. Let's get spooky. Okay, so let's jump right into The Pit and the Pendulum.
Yeah, let's do it.
The story begins, with our narrator being sentenced to death. But they don't tell him how.
They're just like, you're going to die? Figure it out.
Yeah. And he's thrown into this pitch black dungeon, can't see, can barely stand, just total sensory deprivation.
Ugh, that just sounds awful. Makes me claustrophobic just thinking about it.
Right. And that claustrophobia, it's essential to the whole, the terror Poe creates. The narrator's trapped physically and mentally, and he's trying to map out the dungeon just to understand his surroundings.
Yeah, I remember that. He uses a piece of his robe, right, to measure the size of the cell.
Yeah, but it just leads him closer to the edge of
the pit.
The pit, this giant chasm right in the middle of the dungeon.
He's like, The ultimate unknown. A symbol of hell.
Yeah.
You know?
Definitely. It's not just physical death, right? It's that existential dread, the fear of the void. And it's always there, lurking just beneath the surface.
Always reminding you that no matter what, there's always some kind of danger.
Exactly. And then there's the pendulum, probably the most famous part, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, super creepy. This huge blade swinging back and forth, slowly descending towards him.
Poe describes it so well, like you can almost feel the weight of it.
Yeah, and the sound, too, like a whooshing, slicing sound. But it's also more than just a physical threat, right?
No, definitely. It represents time, this relentless march towards death. With every swing, he's closer and closer.
Kind of a metaphor for life in general.
Yeah.
We're all living under the shadow of time, aren't we?
Yeah. And the narrator is completely helpless. Can't stop it, can only watch.
Speaking of creepy things you can only watch. The rats. There are all these rats in the dungeon.
Poe is really good at using, ordinary, gross things to make them truly terrifying. The rats are eating the scraps,
Scurrying around.
Symbolizing decay and death. But they end up being a kind of twisted hope.
Right, because at first he thinks he's tied up with separate ropes. But then he realizes it's just one long band.
And he gets the idea to
use the rats to chew through it.
Yeah. It's kind of brilliant in a desperate kind of way. He puts meat on the band to attract them.
They're these disgusting creatures, but he's rooting for them.
Yeah. And Poe makes you empathize with that, You want the rats to work faster. The pendulum's getting closer and closer.
Yeah, it works. The band snaps. He rolls out of the way.
Such a relief, but only temporary. Because then the walls start moving.
Ugh, right. The dungeon itself is torturing him now.
Crushing him, pushing him towards the pit. It's almost like a physical representation of his mental state, right? His sanity is being squeezed out of him.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the way it goes from a square shape to a diamond shape.
The red hot walls closing in. It's just...
I can't even imagine the heat.
It's like he's being cooked alive.
It makes me think about, we talked about Poe's struggles with addiction. That feeling of being trapped. There's no escape.
It definitely. The dungeon, it's not just the Inquisition, it's his own internal struggles. And then, just when it seems like all hope is lost.
Someone saves him.
A hand reaches out. Almost a deus ex machina, you know?
This feels a little sudden, yeah.
Some people criticize the ending for that, say it's too convenient. But others see it as a representation of grace.
I think it's interesting how Poe leaves it open to interpretation. We don't know who saves him or why.
Right. It adds to that lingering sense of unease, the horrors of the world. They're never really gone.
It's crazy how the pit and the pendulum gets under your skin even after you finish reading it. It's more than just a serious story. It really makes you think,
It really does. How do we cope when we're under that much pressure? And how do we know what's real when we're pushed to our limits?
Yeah. I mean, the narrator's not exactly the most reliable guy, right? Yeah. He even calls himself an imbecile at some point. Yeah. It's hard to tell what's actually happening and what he's just imagining.
Exactly. He's totally losing his grip on reality. That whole question of sanity versus madness, it's one of the things that makes Poe so unsettling. He blurs those lines so well.
Totally. It's like we're right there in his head, experiencing his breakdown with him. And the way he uses sensory details, it just sucks you in.
Ugh, yeah. The rats, the pendulum, the hot walls. He really doesn't hold back.
It's almost like he's trying to make us feel as uncomfortable as possible.
Oh, for sure. But I think it's more than just shock value. He's tapping into something deeper, Those primal fears about pain, confinement, death, it's all very visceral.
And don't forget about the historical context, too. The Spanish Inquisition was a pretty terrifying time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Poe might not have been religious himself, but he knew how to use those images and symbols to create a sense of dread, especially that fear of judgment, divine punishment. It adds a whole other layer to the story.
Yeah, it makes you think about how people cope with those kinds of fears, even today. What happens when your whole world is turned upside down? How do you hold on to your sanity when everything feels like it's falling apart?
Yeah. And even though he's ultimately rescued, that sense of unease, it lingers. It makes you wonder, is he really safe? Can he ever truly escape the trauma of what he went through?
It makes you think, are any of us ever truly safe? I mean, Poe was writing this back in the 1800s, but those fears still resonate today.
Oh, yeah. We might not have pendulums swinging at us, but we definitely have our own versions of the pit,
Yeah.
Those metaphorical traps that we can fall into, whether it's addiction, anxiety, grief.
Absolutely. And that's what we're trying to do with the All Sorts podcast, isn't it? to shine a light on those dark corners, to explore those difficult topics that we often try to avoid. But we do it in a way that's engaging, We want to make learning fun and maybe even a little bit spooky sometimes.
Exactly, just like Poe. He didn't shy away from the darkness, but he also had this incredible ability to entertain, to make us think, to make us feel.
So if you want to join us on this journey of discovery, make sure you subscribe to the All Sorts podcast on YouTube and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our deep dives.
And you can find us on X, Instagram, and Threads, too. We love hearing from you guys, so come say hi and let us know what you think.
Thanks for joining us today, everyone. We'll see you in the next episode.